Talk Show. Recorded live.
Hey everybody, this is Edward Hletke with the Virtualization Security Podcast, episode number 85. And joining me as panelist today is Eben Rodriguez, who's a cloud security infrastructure architect helping eBay adapt new use cases to their internal and external managed compute services. Boris Strongland, who is the co-founder and currently VP of Advanced Products at HITRUST and 20 years of experience in software development, enterprise systems, and security. Myself, Edward Hletke, a.k.a. TechSiWill in the VMware Communities Forum and author of the book VMware vSphere and Virtual Infrastructure Security, as well as VMware ESX and ESXi in the Enterprise, second edition, both of which are available on Amazon. Our special guest panelist this week is Steve Pate, who's the co-founder and CTO of HiCloud Security. Steve has long background in operating system storage, encryption, and key management technologies from companies such as SCO, Veritas, and most recently, Vormetric. And Steve and I had an interesting conversation yesterday about how HiCloud's security encryption software works and where it would be interesting for it to work with inside of the realm. And I have a second California.
That must be me.
You came in on twice?
I just created a new account trying to log in.
Yeah, you came in as another California. You didn't log in.
Interesting.
Anyways, I'll have to get that out of the podcast. But so Steve and I had an interesting conversation about where to put encryption to get for multi-tenancy, for all the types of things like that. So Steve, why don't you tell us a little bit about HiCloud?
Okay, great, will do. So HiCloud was founded by Bill Hackenberger and myself. Bill has a long-time background in the security space. He built out all the sort of development organizations for ISS in California, then went on to Camus and ended up at Vormetric, where Bill and I met. Sort of my background, as you mentioned earlier, is more on the sort of operating system and storage side, lots of versions of Unix, Linux, microkernels, etc. Spent a long time at Veritas, so I've got a good understanding of how to build sort of cross-platform operating system products. So really, I think it's a sort of combination of the security technologies and OS storage level technologies, which brings together what we really need in terms of solutions going forward. So we started HiCloud in 2009 at Vormetric. We were dealing with a lot of legacy systems, backup systems, etc. But as people were starting to virtualize and showing a desire to move to the cloud, we saw a new set of issues that we thought needed to be dealt with. So literally, as you see, the virtual machine is basically the new unit of workload that's potentially migrating in and out of the sort of corporate environment up to the public cloud, etc. We thought that's the element that really needs to be protected. So we built a software solution from the ground up to allow you to protect your virtual machines essentially wherever they go, from the point at which they're created all the way through to the point at which they're decommissioned. One thing we heard a lot of is help me get into the cloud, but also help me get out, and I don't want to leave footprints sensitive to that. So we recognize that there are essentially three places that you can encrypt in the stack. And I think you've discussed many of these on the previous podcasts, but essentially from inside the guest virtual machine itself, potentially at the hypervisor layer, although it's debatable as to whether how achievable that is today, or at the storage layer. And by storage, there are obviously sort of multiple levels as well, from our initial product, which essentially looks like a filer to the hypervisor. And through NFS allows us to see individual virtual machines, so we can encrypt pieces, not encrypt pieces, store them on different classes of storage, and they essentially treat them as a unit of workload, so that we can migrate that virtual machine securely, with it being encrypted. And that's the essence of the initial technology. So the other thing with
Steve, just a quick question. You keep saying virtual machine. Does it work with different, like what hypervisors do you work with? And Does it work with physical, or is it just virtual?
So the current solution, so we've got a sort of full cluster multi-tenant key manager framework, which we'll talk about in a second, but the virtual machine vault, which is said acts like a filer to the hypervisor, is agnostic of hypervisor type. So, the current product is supporting NFS. That's what allows us to get visibility into the virtual machine file layer. And we're also supporting iSCSI. So it gives us sort of independence from the actual hypervisor technology.
So if we can get the virtual machine onto that storage, then it can be encrypted pretty much.
So let's stop right there. There's 3 places to do encryption inside of a virtual environment, and really only 2 places inside of a physical environment. Within the physical environment, you can encrypt within inside of the operating system. So you can encrypt the storage as you write it, a la BitLocker or TrueCrypt, things like that.
Right, so you pick a folder where your critical data is and encrypt that, maybe.
Exactly. Or encrypt the whole drive, which you need to do for laptops. The other place, and that works for any type of system out there, laptops, virtual, or even in the data center. In the data center, you get an extra advantage, and that is you can actually do a decrew device or something like that, an encrypting fiber channel switch or iSCSI switch, or even an encrypting Ethernet switch if such a beast exists. You can actually encrypt the blocks as they're written to disk, so effectively you have data at rest encryption.
So
with a hypervisor, there's a third place to put encryption, and that is actually inside of the hypervisor, at some layer, and there's multiple layers you can put that in. If I do encryption at rest, that's great and wonderful. I mean, there's a couple of companies that do it. I mean, HiCloud does that, acting as a filer with their NFS share. Is that correct, Steve?
That is correct, although we're also supporting iSCSI as well, but that doesn't give you the granularity that NFS does.
Okay. So if I'm doing that, I can do data at rest encryption, and for a cloud environment, or even at any data center, that's incredibly important, because if a drive goes bad, and we all know drives go bad, when the data center takes the drive out of the array and puts a new one in, it rebuilds encrypted. So what are they going to do when they dispose of that drive? If they're going to do anything less of a full-blown, let's grind it up type of approach, they're going to basically have data on there. And when it goes to wherever it is to be reclaimed, that data could be read off. Well, if it's encrypted, we win. So that saves us for that. But there's also several weaknesses inside of the hypervisor when you start talking at this level of encryption. Encryption at rest doesn't actually give us more protection within the hypervisor realm and inside the virtual environment, except for the use cases where the disks may be moved, the arrays may be transported somewhere else and get hijacked. All that data at rest type of functionality.
So it sounds like you're talking about a lot of theoretical stuff, Ed.
No, that's not theoretical.
But I mean, I haven't really encountered too many companies that are following your recommendations for virtual machine encryption.
No, most of them do not. And
so there's got to be something different here.
But they don't even do it for their data center, except for when you're in a government facility.
Yeah, so there's got to be some sort of cost, whether it's performance or dollars or something else, the complexity. What's the advantage of HiCloud? How does it maybe better than other previous solutions? Why do you guys coming out with another encryption technology? What sets you guys apart?
So we've essentially talked about the external filer. So there, as Ed says, you've essentially potentially got exposure at the hypervisor layer. The advantage about exporting essentially clear text to the hypervisor is, for example, one SaaS provider we're working with already does backup, encryption and deduplication at that layer. So for them, it's incredibly important, that the encryption is done underneath the hypervisor. As Ed mentions, you've got a clear text path going through the hypervisor. So we do talk to customers who want to run in uninstrumented clouds like EC2, or they want a full encrypted path between the actual virtual machine and the storage. So, providing a sort of combination of the two technology, I think gives you best of both worlds. So for a certain VMDKs, I've got an encrypted path all the way from the virtual machine down to the storage layer itself through the hypervisor. But, if I snapshot, that virtual machine, or it suspends, or I'm just paging, I'm taking the contents of memory and writing them out in the clear to disk. So, that gives me the ability to access, potentially, not just a whole bunch of sensitive information, but, the encryption keys themselves. So, I think as a combination of both technologies, I can get an encrypted path from the virtual machine to the storage, but, utilizing, our external, virtual machine vault. If anybody snapshots that, then I've got those additional files encrypted as well.
So
Steve, they're only encrypted. Here's another problem with doing that, and it's all data at rest encryption. Once I read the data, once I'm on the hypervisor, once I'm on the management console of the hypervisor, and it doesn't make any difference which hypervisor we're talking about here. It could be vSphere, it could be Xen, KVM, Link Secure, or even in Hyper-V. It makes no difference. If I encrypt from the data within inside of my drive, from within inside of my VM, using whatever encryption technology there is there, let's say it's iCloud, then it's encrypted. The disk itself is the virtual machine disk, or VHD, or whatever you want to call it, is encrypted all the way through to the device. I, as an admin, or a very good electronic copy of an admin, is not going to be able to see that data that is inside of the virtual disk construct. But if they have access to the file system as at that console layer, whether it be, again, Hyper-V, Xen, KVM, or vSphere, you end up being able to see that data again, even if it's a snapshot, because it's no longer encrypted. However, snapshot, that you only get to see the meta file. So snapshot data itself is encrypted at the block level because it's encrypted by the VM. But that also leaves memory files. So if I'm paging, now I have problems with people being able to read the page file, the memory files on the part of the hypervisor. Or if I suspend, I can read those memory files.
But there are mitigating controls.
All that metadata is readable.
There are mitigating controls that users would put in place to prevent those types of attacks from happening.
No. They're talking about the virtual disk. Encryption at rest, if I have, for example, something non-vSphere-like, or something that is should not be there, like a generic Windows machine, and it can't see, it suddenly gets access to that data, it may not have the keys to read it, and that's good. But it still needs the keys. Even if it could mount it, it can't read it without the keys. So encryption at rest, great, wonderful, I agree with it. Encryption within the VM encrypts just the virtual machine, the virtual disk files, all the way down to the storage layer. But doesn't encrypt the metadata that's associated with a virtual machine. And you and I both know there's 10, 15 files of that metadata.
You're talking about like the NVRAM file.
VMX and snapshots, metadata, all that.
All those important things, like if the VMX file got read, now I know where everything is. I know.
And you have the absolute path.
I know exactly what you're using for security. If you're using endpoint security, I know where you're getting it from. I know all the file system, the file layout for all the virtual disk files, like how to put those virtual disk files together because of snapshots. I have possible memory files. I mean, that stuff is still readable from the console.
Okay. So you wouldn't be able to boot that machine up or access any of the data in that machine?
Unless you had if you are the hypervisor, you can.
Yeah, well, the hypervisor is trusted to do that. That's, you want the hypervisor to be able to run the
Yeah,
machine.
you would be able to mount.
Let's pick on domain 0 for a second instead of Xen and KVM, right? If I can get into domain 0, I have rights to read all that metadata. I may not be able to read the actual blocks of the disk if I encrypt from within the VM, but I can read the metadata.
Right. So you can mount it, but you cannot really run it. That's the bottom line.
You would need the guest OS is the one that would have to be able to when the guest OS boots, it'll actually have to decrypt on the fly. Absolutely.
Right.
So, Steve, how do you handle the keys, like the encryption? Is you get to, if it's encrypted with the key, you recycle those keys or rotate? I'm trying to think of the right word. So you want to recycle your encryption keys?
So we have the notion internally of what we call a VM set, which essentially maps to a data store at the hypervisor layer. And through NFS, you can determine through a set of file patterns which of those files within which of the VMs you want encrypted. So for every sort of pattern we match, we generate a unique key. So you could have, say, two administrators, you're managing their own sets of virtual machines, different VM sets, different keys, and even though they're using the same shared storage infrastructure, each administrator may be completely unaware that the other administrator exists.
Is that how you manage multi-tenancy that way?
It is fully multi-tenant, yes. So there are sort of, if you download the product from the website and install it, you'll get one admin with all roles. You can then build that out to multiple administrators with different responsibilities. So keys are delivered from the Key Policy Server cluster to the virtual machine vault, when a file within the VM is accessed. So as we generate encrypted backup images of the VMs, we retain metadata. So if I bring that VM back at some point in time, we'll detect whether the key has expired, whether it's been shredded, whether it's been switched to read-only. We also support full online key rotation. So if my auditor requires that my data needs to be decrypted and re-encrypted with a new key, we'll do that automatic key rotation under the covers without bringing the application down.
We would do that where someone had the keys, maybe left the organization or something like that, right?
Well, there's nowhere in our model where anyone can actually get to an encryption key. So for both the Key Policy Server and the virtual machine vault, we distribute an ISO image so you can install it as a virtual machine or put it on physical hardware. You can't log in, you can't SSH to that box. So if you do put it on hardware, there's never a point at which an encryption key is visible in the clear. Recognizing that if you do an encryption with inside the virtual machine itself, that's different. Regardless of snapshots, etc. If I've got administrative privileges to the box, it's pretty easy to get a hold of the key.
So I got a question. Encryption throughout history has always been one of those chicken and egg things where you make a good encryption code and then someone breaks it and you make it stronger. How are you guys making sure that you're safe? So Ed has a lot of good points about protecting the hypervisor and whatnot. What sorts of things have you guys done to make sure that?
Well, with respect to encryption algorithms, we're just following best practice and to use what are sort of basically.
Right, but I mean, if you say it's safe, and should I just trust you guys and use it, or is there other types of companies or organizations or customers that are using your product or testing it?
Well, if I remember correctly, isn't it AES, and if it's using the appropriate hardware, it uses AES-NI to speed up the encryption?
That's right, absolutely.
Okay, so it's using industry-accepted encryption algorithm.
Absolutely. I mean, the last thing we want to do is go and implement a new encryption algorithm.
So, Steve, I have a question. So you don't encrypt the VMX files. You don't encrypt the VM definition files. Is that correct?
No. So you can encrypt all or none of the files. So if I think about a virtual machine breaking down into a number of VMDKs, VMX files, NVRAMs, spot files, etc., I can encrypt all of them, none of them, or individual ones, based on our sort of policy framework. So, if I want to encrypt everything, I'll essentially just put a wildcard of star, and then everything that goes down that data store path gets encrypted. Or I can be a little more selective and say, I want to encrypt certain VMDKs, not encrypt other VMDKs, and I want to store, different types of files within the VM on different classes of storage. But yes, you can encrypt all of the files.
So if you say, suppose you encrypt the definition files, the VMX files, would that VM still show up in the hypervisor manifest of VMs it knows about?
Boris, that's the difference is that when you're encrypting the virtual machine vault, or that is a filer. So basically, once it's read from the filer, and gets to the hypervisor, it's unencrypted.
I see. I got it. Got it. Okay.
So my second is a filer.
Right. So the second
NFS
question.
and iSCSI, so it's going to be a standard data store.
Right. So I guess my second question is, precisely because this is a filer, wouldn't it be beneficial to implement this in the filer hardware? So suppose somebody like NetApp or EMC can just implement it in hardware on their filing, on their storage systems to automatically encrypt, decrypt.
I'm sorry, so I didn't quite understand the question. So you say put it in front of a NetApp filer?
No, it's part of the NetApp filer. Basically, the NetApp filer can do something like this in hardware every time. It can just encrypt the appropriate files automatically as they come in and go. Wouldn't that make sense?
Right. I mean, you can certainly do that. Sort of most of our customers are actually deploying the virtual machine vault as a virtual machine itself. But we ship a fully fledged operating system, so you can install it on hardware. We provide all of, if you've got direct attached storage, we provide all of the storage level capabilities, different RAID properties, hot sparing, deduplication, etc. So yeah, you can absolutely put it on hardware.
So is somebody doing that at this time?
So
hardware-based encryption?
Experimenting with it, yes. I was quite surprised. I thought most people would initially put it on hardware. But what we're typically finding is, as we launch the product, people want to run everything as virtual machines. That gives them the most in terms of flexibility.
Mm-hmm. So when we're talking about cloud, Boris, it seems like most of our cloud options are not hardware-based but virtual machine-based. So what better place to put your virtual storage? Virtual storage is becoming more and more popular.
Yeah. Interesting.
Well, and also think about it this way: if I'm a tenant of a cloud, I can now use iCloud to encrypt my virtual disk so that the cloud administrators can't get to my data. Granted, they can get to all the metadata about my VM, and if they had access to memory, they could probably decrypt my VM anyways. That's the weakness there. But
right.
What I can do is put the filer in place, send it out as iSCSI or NFS, mount it as an iSCSI target on my Windows or Linux box, and now I have an encrypted target for my database, for example, but my VM is unencrypted, perhaps. I can now play with other things instead of just using data stores, because I may not be able to get this low enough. For example, if I'm a tenant on Blue Coat, for example, or a Colt, I may not be able to convince them to put in iCloud or any of the other solutions like this. There are a couple of others. And if I can't convince them to do that, now I have a mechanism to encrypt my VM without them even knowing it, as well as providing an encrypted data store. Storage location just for my data and no one else's.
Right, absolutely, and EC2 is the prime example of that. They do provide encryption in S3, but they hold the keys. So that's a place where the per VM encryption comes in useful, because I can encrypt those virtual disks up in any cloud without the provider knowing, but I still hold the encryption keys.
So how does that work? Because I thought it's a virtual NAS. So if I
Well, we're really talking about two products here.
Okay.
One is the virtual machine vault. So that requires cooperation of the sort of service provider. So they'll need to install that and basically export those data stores to the hypervisor. Or the new product that we've just gone into beta, where we talked about where I'm doing encryption inside the virtual machine itself. So we have an agent there that is encrypting on a disk-by-disk basis.
And do they share a common key management framework then? So
they do, yes.
Okay.
So the key and policy server cluster will support both of those environments. For the in-guest agent, we introduce a new administrator role we call a cloud administrator, which essentially allows you to manage groups of virtual machines. Or I say virtual machines, they could be physical machines as well, but basically a set of agents, and that doesn't require any change from the service provider.
But you can also put out the virtual machine vault as just an encrypted virtual storage appliance.
Yes, we could do that too. So, and I think you detailed the scenario there. So, if it's exporting essentially an iSCSI interface or an NFS interface to multiple virtual machines, then they've got basically encrypted storage. Now, there are sort of, as I say, we could have a long discussion about the advantages and disadvantages about encrypting at different layers. The virtual machine vault case is great for those environments. We're working with a large SaaS provider who have, a lot of enterprise apps that are being developed all around the world. Now, putting agents into each and one of those, virtual machines is certainly problematic. So the fact that you can provide at-rest encryption without modifying any of the virtual machines, is a big plus. I'm a long-time file system guy, so, I also recognize the problems that inserting drivers into the virtual machine itself. I've got portability and compatibility problems between different versions of the operating system. And if I'm doing encryption at the file system layer, then I've potentially got caching problems as well. So, I've got a mix of clear text and encrypted text data coming into the virtual machine. So, I'm essentially wasting potentially a lot of memory that could be used, for example, as a database cache. So, you can cache at the virtual machine vault layer, or you can essentially cache at the individual VM layer. But, I could potentially be wasting a bunch of memory there.
So, I got a question. Usually with encryption, you think about a performance impact. Have you guys done any testing to see how the performance is impacted? Do you have any data on that?
So this question always comes up. As I say, I'm a long file system guy, so my answer is always it depends. So, I can show you a customer that sees no degradation in performance whatsoever. It just happens that to be more of a transaction processing environment they have. So, databases and operating systems are extremely good at caching. So in that case, the performance overhead is minimal. But I could also, set up an environment that's, extremely heavy write intensive, and therefore the encryption is going to be problematic. Similarly, if you've got ASNI support in your chipset, Intel will tell you you're going to get 8 to 10 times performance improvement. But, that really depends on the hardware and the storage subsystem in place. I mean, typically speaking, we've not seen the actual encryption be that much of an overhead with the customers we've worked with so far. But, one would argue if you've got extremely write-intensive applications, are they the right things to be virtualized or not?
So, what we have is encryption within the VM, and we all know that keys for that still have to live with inside the virtual machine. Given that the keys still have to live within the virtual machine, and the admin has access to memory, whether it's been swapped out or not, on that they can dump it at any time. They could potentially get that key. Now, that's not an easy.
What key are you talking about? This is a PKI-based solution, right?
Doesn't make any difference. The key is still in memory.
What key? Public key?
The certificate or the key is in memory of the VM when you're encrypting within the VM. It has to be. There's no other way to do it.
That's the private key.
You're talking about the storage
the one that does the encryption.
Right.
Whether it's symmetric or not, the encrypting key is available in memory. This has been proven with BitLocker. It's been broken since 2004. The key's in memory. It's breakable. You just have to find the key.
So as this solution gets more robust and the customers expand their infrastructure, it'll probably move to where this is more of a hardware type of NAS, like it was originally envisioned, like Forrest mentioned.
But that's just encryption at rest.
Right. That's the outside encryption.
Let's go down the layers here. When we're encrypting in the VM, the weakness is that an admin or a very good electronic copy of an admin can dump the memory of the VM and get access to the key that's sitting inside the VM. It has to be sitting there because I have to query it from the PKI server, get it to do the encryption by the drivers or whatever I'm installing in the VM. If that's the case and I can get that memory, all I have to do is hunt for it, find it, my haystack went down to a very small amount. It could be a couple of gigs of memory, but, if I get a core file, which is exactly what I get on vSphere, it's very easy to find memory for a given process. So it limits it very, very much to what you're looking for. Now, is that an easy task? Absolutely not. But can it be done? Yes. It has been done with BitLocker. It has not been done with TrueCrypt yet, as far as I know.
Okay, so Ed, so you're talking about encrypting from inside of the VM, but I think
That's
Steve is
inside the VM, which is one thing
Right.
iCloud does. So the other thing, there's 3 layers here. If I was to encrypt effectively somewhere in the hypervisor, and it was high enough up that the service console or the management construct, whatever its domain 0 parent domain, the BusyBox for ESXi or the service console for ESX, if it was high enough up, the admin could not decrypt that data. And regardless of getting the keys in memory, the keys wouldn't be in the memory they could grab and be in the hypervisor memory. So if I could do it somewhere there, high enough up so that it's above the management construct, it's still the data is still encrypted on disk. So when I, as the admin, go to domain 0 and say, let me look at that VM and open up the VMDK or the VHD or the HVM or whatever I'm going to grab, it's still encrypted to me. I can't read the data other than that. It's just still encrypted. If you look at VMware Workstation, that's exactly what they do. VMware Workstation's latest release, 8.0 release, I believe, has encrypted VMDKs. They create a TrueCrypt container, and it's done as part of the VM so that when I'm looking at it in the host, it's encrypted. I can't read it. Okay, so I need to do it if I can do it in the VM kernel, I alleviate that problem. But I still have the other problem. I can read memory. I can dump the memory and look at it any time.
Well, I also think for Workstation and Fusion, so any Type 2 hypervisor, I don't think it's any different to encryption inside the virtual machine itself. We're still talking about operating system processes, and I'm still able to scan memory.
Absolutely, I can get the operating system process of the host. Absolutely. I'm just saying is that it does encryption as part of Workstation.
Right.
It's actually inside the hypervisor layers of Workstation. It's part of creating the VM.
Right, but if it's a bare metal hypervisor, then you wouldn't be able to get the operating system memory, right?
Well, that's the theory.
Presumably.
And you can get whatever your management construct can get access to.
Right.
But if it's done, let's say, within something entirely different, you may not be able to grab that memory at all. Now, if I'm doing it at the filer basis, all I need to do is be inside one of those management constructs and I have full access to everything. We already agree on that. So let's assume, we know we can get the keys from NVM. We know we can see data if we're inside the management constructs of the hypervisor if it's a filer. What mechanisms exist for us to get to the point where even the admin can't see the data? That's true confidentiality, regardless of being able to get dump memory or anything like that. I still think there's necessary one more tool, part of the hypervisor that needs to be done.
You need triple encryption.
No. You want 3
Well, I
bits?
think, as I mentioned earlier, if you can encrypt at the right layer in the hypervisor, then that's the only encryption you actually need. But whether, yes, we can potentially do that with some of the open source solutions today, but it's debatable as to whether how effectively you can do that in a VMware environment.
Well, you can't do it very effectively on any hypervisor, and let me explain why. Each hypervisor's kernel runs as a single CPU, a single core today. All it does is scheduling and say, okay, this VM will run on this core and so forth. So putting a lot of heavy lifting at that layer would be a really bad idea because it would just overwhelm the kernel. Because remember, the hypervisor kernel is not only running scheduling, it's scheduling the network, it's scheduling the CPU, it's scheduling storage, it's scheduling memory. So it's doing the scheduling of all those resources. So if we put it in actually the VM kernel as like an add-on adjunct driver, we have a problem. It'll slow everything down, especially for disk encryption. So there needs to be another way to do this. And that becomes the tricky part. That is unless the hypervisors go to multiple cores, right? Now, VMware's approach is the vShield approach, which is to basically offload security to a VM that you can burn cores on, right? That's what it does. It creates these firewalls. It throws them out. You can burn cores on them. All security solutions do that, and that's great. I can throw as many cores to that solution as necessary. So if I was to do this, say, the same way endpoint security does its stuff, and offload all disk access to a virtual appliance, that virtual appliance would then do all the encryption, and I still can see it unless I dump the memory of that virtual appliance, which I still can do. However, if the hypervisor was to encrypt memory, I could already compress it, but if I can encrypt memory of one VM, just the one doing all my encryption tasks, I've now sped things up quite a bit. I still think encrypted memory is part of the solution.
So you're saying basically just automatically encrypt VM snapshots, including encrypting memory?
If I encrypt the memory, when I do a dump of memory at the console level, it stays encrypted, except for the currently running page. Right?
I think that's doable. That's doable.
And if I have my keys spread out across multiple pages, well, then I saved myself a lot of stuff, a lot of heartache. I only get part of the key maybe when I do that.
So let me up-level the discussion a little bit and ask Steve. So Steve, you obviously you've been talking to a lot of customers or potential customers. So what are their concerns? Are they concerned about some of the things we've been discussing here, or their concerns are much more basic, just basic level encryption, and not concerns with such exotics like dumping memory and finding keys inside memory dumps and stuff like that? What's the real world story there?
So I think you could split the discussion into sort of encryption and key management. So yes, as we talk to multiple people, they do raise similar concerns. Maybe their sort of technical level of abilities isn't as quite as high as the audience, the people on the call here. But yes, some people are concerned about the VM administrator and they want encryption within the virtual machine itself. Other people absolutely want the encryption done underneath the hypervisor. So we see a combination of all. But then I think really what it comes down to, after that, regardless of where you do the encryption, it really comes down to who owns the keys. Do I own the keys? Do I host the key server in my own data center? Do I trust the service provider with the key manager? Or is there a role for a third party, some sort of broker to hold the keys? And I think we're seeing a combination of all of those as well. So just as everybody has different opinions and thoughts about where you do the encryption, everybody has different opinions as well as to who should host and hold the actual keys themselves.
I'd agree with that.
Yeah.
I feel more comfortable if I'm holding my keys. So I would agree with you, but depending on who the organization is, and I think as you go to the larger enterprises, they would agree absolutely. They have to hold the keys. So, for example, you said your encryption with inside S3. The view is, it doesn't matter. If I don't hold the keys, I'm going to encrypt it again. But as you move for different types of customers, down to the sort of smaller SMBs, depending on how technically savvy are, some of them just don't want to host those keys at all. And then, even some of the service providers, I'm happy to host the key services as long as I can never get to an encryption key. So I'm not really responsible for the keys. And there are others who, I'm happy to host the encrypted data or the virtual machines, but I don't really want to host the key management services themselves either.
So are there customers that that this technology is enabling them to do things they couldn't do before, like maybe move systems that have a compliance component to them to the cloud?
Yeah, that absolutely. I mean, when there's sort of the new PCI virtualization guidelines that came out last year, they talk about VM images as snapshots. So we're starting to see that more and more. The auditors are becoming more aware about those issues, and we're starting to see those as come back as requirements towards us.
Do you see any difference between, say, service providers and enterprises in terms of their encryption requirements?
Not necessarily. I mean, the larger enterprises you talk to kind of have sort of similar requirements. They're essentially servicing, potentially within a private cloud or just a data center, multiple departments, and they have some of the same concerns around your encryption and key management, specifically around key management, that a lot of the service providers have. But even within the service providers themselves, there are large and small providers, and obviously the larger ones have bigger concerns, we find, from a legality aspect in terms of who owns the keys or what happens if they get subpoenaed, etc.
I'm just curious if you have any European customers. In Europe, of course, the problem is even more severe because different countries have different data retention and privacy requirements. And if you move a VM from, say, Spain to Portugal, your compliance requirements may be different. Any comments on that?
So that's a great question. I mean, so certainly one of the largest service providers we're talking to have exactly the same problems. Like a lot of pharmaceuticals in Europe won't allow them to migrate data between Europe and the U.S. There are all sorts of concerns around the Patriot Act, etc. And perhaps encryption allows them to do that as long as the keys never leave European soil.
Actually not. Patriot Act and other things, you actually have to look at the treaties. You also have to, this is a major jurisdictional issue, in that for data housed in the U.S., I believe that the keys have to be available to the government at all times. That's the case, regardless of owner, because it's housed here. I think that you may find that the Patriot Act and other acts of that nature provide the government with astounding powers to decrypt data.
Right. Okay. So that really speaks to the case where you can move my encrypted data, but I, the customer, am going to host the keys.
But that's still, you're talking about jurisdictional issues. You're talking about treaties, and it may be that, and law of the land. And it may not, let's just not pick on the Patriot Act. Almost every country has something similar. That data, if that is the case in the law, if you don't understand the law of the land of where you're putting your data, you may end up being in trouble.
Right.
So does that mean if I'm the customer, I hold my own key, can I get a subpoena from, say, U.S. or European court to forcing me to hand over that key for the VM to be decrypted?
That's a possibility, yes.
So the easy thing to do here would be to make sure that that VM has its own set of keys, and then you rotate the key for that VM, and then you can give that away without giving away the encryption for everything else, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, that's where multi-tenancy really benefits here.
In this, if you can do encryption in the VM, and you make it sufficiently difficult to get the key out of memory, then the cloud admin can't see it.
So, Steve, is there any kind of limits on how many VMs I can support, or how many keys or tenants? What are you guys looking at for scale on this?
So
either
no,
now or
no
down
to
the
both
road?
of those questions. So no limit to the number. So I think one of the things we built out the sort of an N-way active key management cluster. From a high availability perspective, I never want a node going down in the cluster to prevent me from delivering keys. But also from a scalability perspective as well. So we thought from day one, let's look to the potential of really servicing millions of encryption keys.
This
And that's actually really good, because if I can get this level of encryption in the VM and the keys are sufficiently hard to get around, this is really cool, because now I can actually get the biggest problem I have with secure multi-tenancy is that there really is no security, because the cloud admin can see my data and modify it, either see it, which breaks confidentiality, or modify it, which breaks integrity. Now if I do something like this, it makes it much more difficult. Close that window, and secure multi-tenancy is a possibility. If I go to step further and offload encryption inside the hypervisor, and I do key exchange in such a way that the admin is not actually involved and can't see it, now I've actually made that a reality. But in order to do it, I think you still need encrypted memory of at least the VM that holds all the keys that does the encryption. If that makes sense.
Yeah, but without sort of hardware support for that, how do I do that in a manner that's actually performant?
Well, you need an HSM.
Right.
You need an HSM pass-through to the VM, and I can do that on just about everything as long as the HSM is a PCIe type card. Or even over the network, I can do a network-based HSM. I can definitely do all that.
Okay, so I can access that HSM card from the virtual machine itself?
If I do pass-through PCI, yes.
Right, okay. But then
I've been able to do that in Xen and KVM for years, as well as VMware. Most people don't do that, but you can. But it'd be a pin to the VM. It's by no means multi-tenant.
What about multi-tenancy in your HSM card? Or do any of those capabilities exist today?
I don't know. It'd be nice if it did.
Yes, absolutely. Because I think ultimately the answer to a lot of this is to do it in hardware. The question is, A, does the hardware exist today, and B, does it work in any virtualized environment?
Encrypting CPUs exist today where they encrypt memory and instructions. Those exist but aren't commonplace. You won't see a server with them in there. They're kind of in the labs today. That I do know, because I showed one at RSA 2 years ago. That's a step in the right direction. Or a direction. I'm not sure if it's the right or wrong direction, but it is a direction. I mean, this is interesting because, to me at least, is that we've got availability down pat. We have governance, risk, and compliance down fairly well, too. But integrity and confidentiality is still kind of up in the air.
As well as some way of being able to determine whether they are following rules, like a third-party audit.
Well, no, third-party audits are happening as well. That's part of GRC. The assessments, our tools are available, but for in the VM at least. But when we start talking about these others, integrity and confidentiality, until we have that, I'm not sure we can do a truly secure multi-tenant environment.
I would agree.
Even your thoughts?
Yeah, I would agree.
I mean, what else can we try doing?
I think this is a step in the right direction, though. I mean, for some customers, it might not be enough. Like for you, someone who memorizes the last 4 digits of every certificate serial number, no security would probably be good enough for you. But it solves a lot of challenges.
The middle four. The middle four.
In the reverse order.
I can fake the last four and the first four, but the middle ones that are hard.
So, but I still think that this solves a lot of headaches for customers who are trying to meet some compliance needs or have safety between various customers or departments, and they want some sort of multi-tenancy encryption on the go.
Boris?
That's the biggest complaint that I always hear is the confidentiality and encryption. Every time. I know you hear that as well, even.
Yeah, well, I like the idea that as an admin, I don't have access to the key.
Yeah.
I only have access to the key policy server where I can say, generate a key or rotate the key or delete the key. I don't ever get to see what that key is. So I feel protected that I personally wouldn't be accused of stealing data or stealing the key. So from that point of view, it offers me as an administrator a peace of mind.
I totally agree with that.
But does it? I mean, think about this way. I encrypt in the VM, so all the blocks of the virtual disk.
So in the court of law, I need to be proven innocent, guilty beyond the shadow of a doubt. And
only
I can cast doubt here.
That's only
in a
criminal case.
Is it non-reputable? I don't know.
That's only in a criminal case. It's beyond a shadow of a doubt.
It'd be hard to prove that I did it.
In a civil case, it would be. It just has to be proved.
It'd be easy for us to say that you did it because you know how to do all that stuff.
Well, let me just say that I agree with Ibn that it's much better practice when the admin doesn't actually have access to the actual key. In fact, at HITRUST, we implemented something similar for root level passwords, where the system would issue and manage the root passwords, but every password is issued to a specific person, and you have a complete record of what password was issued to a specific person. Then you can track it. And typically the admin doesn't have access to running password. So I think that principle is pretty valid. I don't know if it's going to stand up in criminal court, but
I would agree, absolutely.
Just from a manageability aspect, if I'm managing tens of thousands of agents, I don't want to see any keys.
Correct. So the big question that I have in this is how all this fits into an existing virtual environment. Where are all the connections? So we know that it has to some admin has to manage the keys, but can't see them. But the key transfer has to happen through some mechanism that may actually put the VM at risk, or put the key server at risk.
Well, that's what our friend Mr. Diffie helped us with the key exchange, though.
If you're on the endpoint, the key exchange is hackable, but.
So as it said, without a virtual machine vault layer itself, you can't log in or SSH in, so you can't get access to the key. So, certainly as we've discussed, if the encryption's within the VM itself, there are always ways to get to the key. But as you said, that doesn't necessarily mean it makes it easy once you have the key to decrypt the data. You've got to know an awful lot more information than just having the key itself.
I would agree.
Right, having the key itself, in my classes, I always say, well, that's kind of like having the fat kid watch the pie. You don't want to keep it out of their hands.
Come on. I've never heard that one before.
Oh, no, don't worry. I won't eat it.
So we can try to call on all the hypervisor vendors to encrypt memory to make this better. And that may or may not be coming. No one can really speak to that.
But, Ed, we still have to decrypt it to use it. So it's got to be fast.
Fast. Has to be done in the CPU.
Right.
And it's only a page at a time anyway. So all we can do, I think, is close the window to a single page.
Mm-hmm.
That's as close as we can get, unless we have an encrypting CPU.
So how much overhead would this CPU encryption add to a typical calculation, typical performance. I mean, is this realistic?
It has to be a CPU designed for it, so there is no overhead. No system.
Well, there's got to be some.
Generally, they'd probably put a core to it. I mean, you've got AES-9, I mean, adds, 5% using it versus 20% if you don't?
The overhead's pretty small.
Hmm.
I do know that a lot of companies have gone to using all HTTPS. I know it's a different topic, because Google did this research and found that they only added 1 to 2% overhead with today's processors of encrypting everything. So it's not as big of a performance hit as we used to think it was.
As long as you have those today's processors inside of your virtual environment, that absolutely is true. And what we should do is bring that up as a conversation for another time. Different conversation, but it's actually a very valid one. Similar, but in nature, but different. Still the same. I'll put that on the schedule. Good thing to bring up. So, Steve, last thoughts.
Well, just to summarize, I think based on, just the conversation we've had here today, plus, what we looked at and where we're going as a company, we can't plug all the holes, but we do recognize that, people require encryption at different layers in the stack. And, we have looked at the possibility of doing a hypervisor level solution as well. But, recognizing that, in-guest encryption is going to work well in some environments. Encryption at the storage layer is going to work well in different environments, and perhaps a combination of the both is the best we can do in plugging the hole today. But, having said that, regardless of where you do the encryption, as Bruce Schneier said, key management is often the Achilles heel to an otherwise good solution. So, there's a lot of open solutions out there today. But I think for encryption to be widely deployed, then you need to bring in a key management solution that makes it extremely easy.
I would concur. So actually, my last thought is I think encryption at rest is absolute must today in today's cloud. I think encryption in the VM is the only way we're going to get close to where we need to be. But this is only for those VMs I want to dial the security to 11. I don't need to do it for everything. I need to do it for those ones that have critical data. And knowing what that data is part of your risk analysis, which is part of your basic policy. You absolutely have to follow through and do everything so you know exactly what data is in the cloud and what you need to encrypt so you don't burn more and more core that you don't need to. And with that, I'm going to leave the very last comment to Boris. Boris, you have one?
Right. So I echo both of your sentiments. I think encryption of VM data is very important. I think HiCloud is solving an important problem and plugging really a big hole there, and it should make high-value, high-risk VM deployments into the cloud much more feasible. So having said that, something to live with is sort of a bit of science fiction. As you probably all heard about quantum computing, right? So today's encryption systems, they're all based on the same mathematical principles. And presumably once quantum computing becomes reality, all of those encryption systems will just fall because it will become very easy to decrypt all this stuff. And that's why all the world's intelligence agencies are collecting encrypted traffic all the time in the hopes of decrypting it later. So this is something just to live you with. Nothing is forever.
I mentioned that it could be argued it can't be decrypted, but we have to say by today's standards.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, thank you, everybody, for joining me at the Virtualization Security Podcast, episode number 85. Look forward to talking to you guys in 2 weeks.